Moving on, Jeff, you were leading, and I was actually as sort of observing and omnipotently, is that a word? Participating in this conversation, but take us through document tagging and why were we in this room? I think that was a big question we were trying to figure out, right? Why are we here?
Yeah, I think we had a little bit of this. Why are we here? And it actually started off, Carol and Matt and the team had worked through some scenarios to actually map this stuff out and then come up with a final. Procore has actually built a tool that works on it, but we actually took a step back, and because we were combining two groups that were a bit separate at the event originally, we had to reset and kind of give everybody understanding where we were and debating whether or not the standard of the ISO 9650 that's used in Europe and now adopted in a lot of other countries could be adopted to here. Why was it? And it kind of moved from, are we having a talk about data? So it's interesting, you guys went all around, everybody ended up somewhere in data and understanding data and data governance and whether or not these kind of standards would work for us. It was also interesting to see two teams come together and try to kind of storm and norm all at the same time. I think we kept pretty much storming most of the time, but it really ended up for me in the spot around a discussion of what that data is and if we could prove that we not only need this current set around design documents, but if there's more that we could, and if this was something the United States could actually benefit from, and if so, how would we go about that? Yeah, thanks for the healthy debate, everyone. That was a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah, it was. It felt like it was almost frustratingly iterative, but it was actually brought a lot of clarity. And so, yeah, for those of us that are in this world, it was a productive conversation. But if you're not in this world, it was probably like, what were they talking about?
This is the crux of what brought us to this conversation today, was to be able to understand or identify the minimum standard fields, meaning the need to have versus the nice to have fields to move across the publish, receive, and organize channels. So this is where it makes a little bit more sense. So we've had some conversations leading up to this to be able to better understand what's the need to have, what's the nice to have. So at this stage, this is where I'm going to hand it off to those that are way better versed in ISO 19650 than I am to be able to identify what are those fields that could be agreed upon and what is pertinent to this particular standard.
Hi, yes, so I can share what fields we have today. So a little overview of what we have within Procore today. So it is a new document management solution in beta. And in our settings is where we specify all of the document fields. Today we have 21. We'll allow customers to, create their own custom fields and rename some of these if they want. But they'll be able to select, which ones are required. So we did have, very similar to the list that you just showed, was the type, the name, which is more of the naming standard, the description, the revision, and it tells you what format it's in, string, text. Some of them are free form inputs, some of them are drop downs. The status is really important, and this status will tie into our approval workflows as well. And those status fields are customizable, so the customer can decide, what status is and descriptions they want to add in those drop downs. Uploaded by, created at, uploaded at, classification of the document, updated file format, created by, file size, it just keeps going on. Phase, project, originator, the volume or system, location, trade, and number. So those were the 21 that we have decided to, be default at the start of this. And then for any given customer, they can make, every time they upload a file, they can make certain fields required for upload before the doc controller can submit it to others. And these required fields tie into their naming standard, whether it's whatever flavor of ISO they need, they can customize the order of these and how many there are. So if you had a very specific naming standard or convention, you can move these around, you can delete them, you can add more, any of those 21 that we have. And this is where you could, select which ones you actually want to add to it, to the document list. So this all drives this name here that gets populated for the customer before they're able to submit. There is a holding area where if our machine learning doesn't pick up the metadata and automatically populate it, this is where you would enter the description and the type of document. And you can, change these fields, of course, however they want to have them presented. But this is, again, in beta, but this is how we are thinking about adding
Matt,
all of those fields. Yeah.
Matt, if I can pause you for a second, Kelly, it looks like you got your hand raised.
I do. I have a couple of things I'm trying to just work out through my head here as we switched from Carol to Matt is, trying to retain the statement in my head of what we're trying to achieve here is a little bit challenging. And trying to stay tool agnostic in this portion of the conversation is a bit difficult.
Yes. So if you want to take a quick step back, Matt, maybe when we did that transition, the ISO 9650 standard didn't really come up. So if you guys can kind of talk about what the product was built for, I think we kind of jumped that. So I don't know if that's Travis, Matt, or Carol that wants to take it, but it's in reference to the ISO 9650 standard, right?
Yeah, and I should have prefaced that. So my apologies for that, because I think really what we decided to show it in Procore and use a specific tool. However, all this it's just really to get a visual of what's involved in adhering to this particular standard. So we're just using this as a visual representation and not necessarily tool specific, just to show the type of work that's involved in being able to bring this standard into the US.
Sure, and I understand that. My challenge with that is, I think it's safe to say that everybody that's in this particular breakout is at least somewhat tech savvy. So if we're talking about these, all we need to understand is the fields. We don't need to know that Procore is in beta with these tools or what formatting looks like in those tools. We need to understand what type of data we're talking about using and how it's helpful to what the mission statement is that we're trying to achieve. And I haven't heard any of that since Matt started talking.
Apologies. Yeah, so I didn't know how best to present all of the fields for ISO, but that is how the market, the compliance standards are, kind of required for all of those documents to have that naming standard. Based on all of those metadata fields.
I appreciate that. I mean, the listing just kind of showing what they were, that part is helpful, but the rest of it, I think, is kind of, that part is getting into the tool, which doesn't really help us make sure that we're meeting that mission statement, which again, I think some of us are just kind of getting into this particular statement, because somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I think we merged two groups or something maybe.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm still trying to wrap my head around.
So I'm still trying
to
to make sure that I have the right mission statement in my head or statement in my head, because I have an older one that definitely doesn't align. And so I'm kind of like, wait, hold on. So I don't know if we have maybe like I don't even know what it is, a Post-it note or something we can get to like look at that, because for me, I'm the recipient at that far end of the right side of the diagram that we were showing. And all I'm thinking as we're talking about this is I love the idea, but no matter how much data and what data we pull from the design all the way through over to the contractors, it's never going to answer our questions that we have. So that's what I'm trying to make sure I can wrap my mind around what this statement is of what we're trying to solve.
Yeah, in general, and I'll like kind of apologize. I think Matt and I are kind of new to this, these breakouts, and so
Sure.
didn't necessarily know how to best communicate some of this. But the interesting part of like this issue is ISO 19650 is a large requirement in Europe, not a large requirement in the US. The reason it's a requirement in Europe is just because it has some standardization of the naming fields already and the data that's associated with it, which is kind of what Carol's pointed out is like where we've at least started to say, hey, if the US wants to approach some standards for document handoff from architect to contractor, then we need to have some additional metadata fields that hopefully will work for the US industry specifically.
So Kelly, let me share this because yes, what happened here, guys, is that we combined two groups together at this point. So a few of us have had some in the pre-calls. We're kind of catching up because we did two different things, and we're going to bring ours in later, Kelly. But let me get you folks. So now you should see the new "How might we," Kelly, for this group.
Yes.
Is how might we adopt an international standard for the exchange of digital design documents? Now, they were in a different breakout than we were, and we're going to come to ours later, but this is the how might we adopt an international standard for the exchange of digital design documents in ways that adapt, how might we, in ways that adapt to real world scenarios that will vary across market and contract delivery type.
All the points that Kelly always makes.
Yes. So that project teams can benefit from adopting the standard regardless of project mandate. So this is the group that worked on this, worked on mapping it out. And then actually what happened with the Procore team is they started to actually implement this in a document management system that allowed them to take this a little bit further. So does that reset you a little bit, Kelly, so that you understand?
I think I think it does a little bit. And I think maybe the challenge that I'm having with this is that Procore is still in development with this, if I understand right. This is in beta.
Well, they're user, but they're not in the US. Like the whole thing is
right. No, but the release of this tool in the US is in beta. Is that correct?
There's someone that wants to use it, I'm sure. I don't know.
Right. Okay. So I guess my question is, we know that Procore exists. We know that there are other tools that do this maybe in their own ways, but in extremely similar features and processes. So what is left to solve in this how might we statement other than pick your tool?
Justifying the time it takes to use that tool, because just because you have the tool, part of the point, I don't know if I wasn't in it earlier, was how much time it takes to be on the admin side, like just how much is in there. And I think we underestimate the amount of time to the point you always make, Kelly, of like we don't spend enough time in the planning part.
Absolutely.
And so I think that is part of this point of like how much should we estimate for the investment in this upfront planning and mapping and whatever that's going to be different on every job. So just account for it. But we also need platforms like what was shown by Procore. But yes, I'm sure Autodesk has an equivalent. I'm sure others have equivalents. That's not the point. The point is that here is what it takes to use these types of systems. And here in the US, we don't even have like a business mechanism to even, or a mandate or whatever to make it happen. So it's a not an easy question to solve, which is why we're having this conversation. But what are the mechanics in the US, knowing that we have examples that some of us are more or less familiar with of where other parts of the world are doing this, and like what can we learn from them, knowing our situation is different, but maybe pick pieces of it to use it. I don't know. Hopefully that provides a little bit of context of what I think this objective is.
Yes. And then Nick, it looks like you have a question. Sorry.
Yeah. So I'm a bit new to the, I'm trying to understand what the problem is. If there's a naming nomenclature that's set up by the international standard and it's based off of the specific metadata, is the question, I have a different document filing system that I need to do for this project, and how do I achieve both at the same time? Or like, I'm having trouble understanding if there is a problem with this, if they already have a prescribed standard for how to name documents, and how that might differ from what other people may want to do. Or is this really just like an enablement thing? Is, can I name files the way I want to name them, and can I output files to meet the ISO standard and have that naming convention just applied to it?
Gotcha. Travis, did you want to take that, or Carol, did you want to take that?
Yeah, I would say that I think the bigger question for this group, like to me, is kind of twofold. Is one, we know that there is an international standard. So does this group feel like the international standard meets the US needs? So I think depending on that question, but also looking at question 2, if you want to dive into the international standard and look at the metadata fields, do those meet the US needs? If they do, then it's obviously easier to adopt the ISO. If we feel like they don't, then maybe we don't want to adopt the ISO. But that's, and Nathan, correct me if I'm wrong here, maybe that's something that we would want to be able to push out from this group to say, hey, like, we've kind of looked at the metadata fields from ISO 19650. We feel like they meet generally the US standards and what we're feeling like the best practices are from the US standpoint. So our recommendation could be to go that route, or we would want to make some changes. So
well, yeah, I was taking your same question and flipping it a little bit. I wrote in the chat, like, is there a need in the US that we could go, oh, hey, ISO 19650 like already solves that need? Like, to me, that's the win-win, right? Is that it's, a need can already be met by an existing standard versus a standard looking for a need. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's part of the strategy of how we do this, right?
Yeah, and just to continue on that thread is, why does the standard exist? How is it being used? What are the outcomes of this? There's clearly an idea that, by having this standardized across all of the projects by whomever might be working on it, we could be gleaning something. I imagine there was an impetus to creating the standard. And so I think understanding how the standards being used, what those objectives are, and are there gaps for the US model, and are there new things or things that we need to remove to do data collaboration across all of the different companies and vendors, I think makes sense. But like, I don't think we're digging into like what the fields are, why are they being called, what are we hoping to do with this standard? That's what I think would be valuable for this conversation.
So go ahead, Carol. I saw you unmuting.
Okay, yeah, no, I was just about to share my screen because we did identify some of them, and that was it. Essentially, at the end of the summit, we were trying to identify what are the need to haves and what are the nice to haves. And I think this is where, like I said, this is where that whole ISO 19650 came up. So if I can share my screen, that covers all of them. Yeah.
If memory serves me, I think we even referenced some of this stuff directly from what Travis and the team had gotten to, or Travis Stensby, and then just matching which of these were ISO 19650 fields versus what were kind of above and beyond. Exactly. And seeing where they match.
Although I'm not clear on the color coding, that wasn't my doing. So.
Oh we can not really pay attention. Yeah, that would basically what are ones that you can autofill versus drop down versus. But you can just disregard those.
Okay. So am I to understand though those that do have these button type icons here are more the need to have?
It was part of ISO 19650. Yeah, it's representing that it is a key term, or what one of those 8 fields. So that's the specific wording that they use there. So anything that doesn't have a colored box next to it is essentially information that would be above and beyond the standard naming convention. And that gets into a little bit of that discussion. Kelli, I still remember you blowing my mind in Denver about like what is metadata versus source data, and like which of these things are like information about the document or about the object versus like the timestamp of when it was passed along, or like kind of this more superfluous information. So even just getting clarity on that, I think there's benefit in this industry, because I think there's a lot of confusion on that front of clearly identifying what do we want. Obviously, timestamps and stuff are less important for us. It's or as a trade, it's actual source information like you're talking about that you think you will never get, but I don't know, like maybe we just haven't gone down that rabbit hole far enough to be clear about what we would want to ask from them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of information here, and I'm actually kind of surprised that more of these aren't marked off by ISO 19650. Some of them I think are going to be carried over in basically whatever tool you use, regardless of the standard.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it does. Yeah, it's just not part of the naming convention. It doesn't mean it wouldn't be included somewhere. It's just not an official part of the naming convention. But to that point, how often do we date stamp our files, right? Which ISO 19650 does not recommend you do, or even versioning of files, it does not recommend you do. So like there's just blocking and tackling that we can talk about of like, how we name files, because that's such a big deal in BIM, of like how we've always done it versus how we should do it. And maybe there are some traditional kind of digital age, not necessarily cloud integrated age ways of doing it that we need to abandon in order to really take hold of this industry 4.0 stuff.
Yeah, I mean, version is a huge thing now. We used to, put it at the end of a file, V1, V2, V3, so that we knew which one that we were on. Now, if you're using a cloud-based system or some, network-based systems too, you upload it and it automatically controls the versioning for you. So we should be eliminating that from our naming convention. But whether it gets carried through the data is a different story, right? So that's the other thing too, is discerning, do I need to track the versioning and the revisioning, or do I need it as part of the name, are also two different things and two different data points that need to be discussed. And there's a lot of information here that's also very, to me, ambiguous. So understanding and what each of these data points means and why they're important, like what does classification mean? I mean, I could probably list off 10 different things that classification could be.
It's like our equipment and asset conversation we were having.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Equipment, right? What's an equipment? What's fixture? What's fitting? Yeah.
And part of that question is, does that matter as long as the team decides what they're going to call it at the beginning? Like, I think that's part of this all coming full circle.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we're going to have the conversation, I think understanding better what exactly we're trying to accomplish first. Are we trying to figure out what data we need, or are we trying to figure out if ISO 19650 is a standard to adopt?
Well, and what data we need when? That's the whole point of these boundaries, right? Is how often are we having a conversation where one person was thinking about a downstream boundary and another person was thinking about an upstream boundary? And it's like, guys, that's apples and oranges. We shouldn't even be having this conversation. Like, let's make sure we're on the same page. So there's a lot to this of just having structured, productive conversations to get to clear requirements.
Question to Matt and Travis, or Travis, were there any insights from your UK team on the adoption in the UK?
Yeah, so in the UK, they were the first to do ISO. And I should go back. I didn't know where we were starting in this conversation, so apologies, Kelly. This has nothing to do with Procore. Yeah, I just didn't have a slide handy to show all of the fields. So when it started, the founder of the ISO committee said it originated from a British standard, BS 1192, and the whole thing showed that it was saving construction companies 22% on costs just having this standardization, and that's where it originated from. And they were, did their own flavor of it. So since then, all the other countries in the world, Australia, Canada, France, Germany, they have all adopted ISO, but in a different flavor. Their standards are different. The metadata fields may be called something different. So in the US, we can adopt or annex however we feel makes sense. But yeah, what did that answer the question? Carol, what was the?
Yeah, I think you did a pretty good job there, Matt, of kind of getting your head around the reason that the UK did this and the reason the standard was created was because they found a savings. That's not something we do here in the United States on a regular basis. So, you know, showing what you mapped out and how you mapped it out to utilize and facilitate that's important. Now, I think it becomes, do we as a country or can we as an industry, because let's be honest, in this country, we don't do it that way. Can we adopt something like this to see those same savings?
Well, and this ties back into the conversation one of the other groups is having, is that idea to implementation, right? We don't do things unless the client requires it or we know that it saves us money. So prove that it's going to save us money to standardize the naming convention of every type of document that ever gets used, and we'll do it. Which, I mean, we all know, all of us here know that yes, if we standardize everything, then we'll be able to find every document we ever need a lot faster. But the effort to get there is the roadblock to the ROI.
Yeah, and I think it might compound too, is because if you design for everyone, you design for no one, and a lot of this metadata is not useful to the person sitting at the desk or the person sitting in the field. So how do you leverage both need cases for a collective data to be findable by anybody who understands a standard versus who needs to find it, who's on that job right now?
Well, as a trainer, though, this is something that always gets debated when you have an implementation of anything is first you have to create a standard, then you have to teach the standard. There is no eliminating of teaching the standard.
Yeah.
So you have to teach whatever you come up with, you have to teach people how to use it. So, Matt and Travis, you know, in Procore, in any of the tools, one of the options is defining the document type. Well, that's an important part of that, because if a guy out in the field or a girl out in the field goes to look for something and they don't know what type of document it is, they need more training. We can't make the tools any smarter than that to help them find it. They need to know if it's an RFI or a submittal. And if they don't know that, they need to go back to some sort of training for that. So there's a certain point where it has to say, look, this is a logical naming convention that we decided on as our standard, and now you will be trained towards that.
Yeah.
Well,
Would we
then there's
not
also
want to have a tag that doesn't care what kind of document it is. I mean, I don't want to get into branding or whatever, but a certain product that was presenting earlier, their new version of the search is pretty cool in that it doesn't care what the type of document is or the type of record is, but it does tell you what it is. So if you type in fitting, like that was a word that was used earlier, it's going to bring up a bunch of stuff, RFIs, submittals, meeting minutes, all kinds of things. And then it's up to the user to figure out, oh, meeting minutes is what I was looking for. And I think in some of those tools, you can filter for, you know, the types of records as well. So like we were just working with someone with our in-house counsel where he wanted stuff specifically out of meeting minutes. So having the ability to like do a search, then realize, oh no, I only care about the meeting minutes, and then start to drill down that way. But he found an RFI in that process that he didn't know he wanted, because if he had just been searching meeting minutes, he would have lost that. So I think having maybe more tags is better than less sometimes, and letting people figure out what they're, you know, maybe they don't know exactly what they're looking for. They might trip and fall and find something that's actually useful that they didn't know they needed.
Well, I think that's also a matter too of how technology functions, right? We have tags, we have naming conventions. A lot of the different tools do use tags on top of that, or have sorting conventions for the different modules or components of their tools and things, and those that are available. So yeah, you can find things by looking up a keyword, or you can say, show me all the RFIs. How they build their tools, how your company decides to implement a naming convention versus what becomes a tag is something that's decided in-house and you train to, because that's the type of thing that, as much as we talk about standards, as much as we know what's going to help us get things done, we can't make every company do everything, right? That's one of the known facts of the US, right? Is we don't like the idea of industry standards or government standards or, you know, universal standards. Nobody's going to say, oh, ISO 19650 is perfect, and we're just going to do everything because I love somebody else telling me what to do. That's just not how we operate here, right? We want to know, I want it this way. I like these, but I want to do it this, this, and this, and not that. Great. So you can customize it in these different tools and then decide, and you train your company users how to use it that way. If you use that same tool when you go somewhere else, you still know that you have the options to customize by that and make it either part of the naming convention or part of the tag. But we still give ourselves that freedom to do those things because the tool is set up to be customized.
Right, which goes back to what they were showing earlier, is there's a bunch of optional tags that can get arranged, at least if I understood what they were showing earlier, that there's a bunch of optional tags that can get arranged effectively to create a file name based on how each individual company wants it. Or for that matter, to your point, I mean, half the time we can't even get people to do what the company standard is, let alone a national standard. So, you know, if the individual project wants to rearrange their stuff in a snowflake fashion, they can do that. But I think that's where that was headed, right? It was like, at a minimum, maybe it would be nice to have a group of agreed upon, like 10, 15, 25, 30, 100, whatever optional tags that then everybody can sort of arrange as they see fit. I guess thinking out loud, interestingly, even then downstream, like if I'm a GC and you're an electrical contractor working for us, I give you the same file, you could actually rearrange those tags. It'd still be the same file. You get them in the order you want them in, but it would effectively be the same tag in the same file. We wouldn't, you know, we'd have some continuity there.
But what you're talking about though is you're still talking about within a platform. What we're talking about is up here, the data. I don't want it as a tag, I want it as data. So however Procore or Autodesk or anybody else uses it, whether it's a tag or file naming, is fine. And everybody can decide how to do that. What we're talking about selecting for uniformity from those list of options, we're not calling it a tag, it's just data. So I can bring it into a database, I can bring it into an Excel file, I can bring it into an actual platform that I've purchased or whatever. I'm not limiting it to only being a tag, it is data.
I'm glad that you said that, Kelly, because I think it is important to not think about these as tags and think it more as data, just conceptually. Because tag implies a little bit more like a UI versus back of house. And what we're trying to standard is like what we want. In one case, the architect to be able to hand over to the GC, or the GC to be able to hand over to the subcontractor, whichever one of those scenarios, we want some data associated with these documents. So you can control your drawings easier with that data and don't have to, the administrative time really generally should be a burden of one company, not multiple companies, if we can pass it as data.
Yeah, and the other thing that we're trying to work with within our framework of these definitions is we know that not everyone's going to use the same tool always. The general contractor is going to have a document management or project management tool, whatever platform they select. And the subcontractor, the trade, myself, we're going to have something else that we use as our corporate platform. And even if they are owned by the same company, even if we're buying from the same vendor, they're not the same account. We're not pulling data from the same database. So we still have to exchange the data somehow. And that's what we're trying to eliminate, is that barrier right now where no matter what tools we use, your data's here and my data's here, and the only way to get them to each other is manual. So we're trying to eliminate that manual barrier between the data, where the only way I can do it is you hand it to me and I literally enter it back into my system like it never existed in the first place. What we want to do is get it so that it can pass through automated the way that data should be able to talk to itself. And that means it has to be agnostic of the different tools, and it has to be in a data form so that it can be read and passed between these different tools.
I would say even too is like, how do you go about like project naming conventions? Like we almost have to assign a universal ID because of how these things could be named. They could end up overlapping on a data level. So how do we create the controls in place for this system to ensure that there is no conflicts or duplication?
Yeah, I'm waiting for the chance to get to take the data with what Procore is doing, with what Autodesk is doing, and have a project that both teams have platforms that say they can exchange the data and actually try to exchange the data the way that they say it can be exchanged, so that we can see where because there's going to be those pitfalls, right, Nick? And see where those are and say, hey guys, valiant effort. These are the parts that we need to shore up before we can actually exchange the data. And maybe in the meantime, I can create something in-house that runs a script to add the data to make it work the way I need to, but that we can then work with all of our vendors that are participating here and the ones that want to, even if they're not, and say, okay, look, this is what needs to go above and beyond that to get that data to actually pass through. But I think, again, what we're talking about here is fantastic, but what we really need to do is define that individual data and what type of data it is, because I feel like I got brought into this conversation late, which is fine. So I don't know if I'm supposed to start with like the list that Carol shows. Like, that's locked in and that's the data that we're going with. And somebody can explain that to us so that we can move forward with it, or are we going to refine that list?
I'll give my best response because I love your questions, Kelly. I love the challenges, so I'll challenge you back.
I will always challenge you. You know this.
The answer is yeah, and I'm really mad that this computer doesn't have a camera. Sorry, if I was on a different computer, you'd see my face. But the answer is about context. So let's say that is the broader information that Procore could handle within a given exchange. But again, which exchange is it? Is it the point where a designer is submitting something to an owner that you're not going to end up getting later for a while? Or is it, like when is it happening and who's doing that activity will then give us the context to say which of these things need to be there. And that is really what this culminating kind of matrix that looks at the sequence of activities and then the pieces of data within a given document that are required at that given activity or exchange point. It's the combination of all those things together. So like just this list isn't going to help anyone, right? It's the list within the context of the activity in the given time that will narrow down to a certain amount of these. Not to say that we need any of the other ones any less, but we're giving that context as to which ones I'm using in which situation. And again, like from a development standpoint, I don't even know if that's helpful. I mean, it's helpful for us to figure out the rules. I don't know if that's helpful from a development standpoint. Like that's where I'm.
Yeah.
But we're getting close. I mean, every conversation, we're getting closer to bridging this gap of,
No, I think it's super helpful though, because when we talk about this, like, okay, the one that we did was easy because when we're talking about parts and geometry and purchasing, the list is pretty much always the same. The part always has length, width, depth, diameter, those types of things. But when we're talking about a process, when you have an RFI, when you have a submittal, when you have an issue, when you have a drawing, when you have all these different things, the data that comes out of each of those or goes into each of those is extremely different. And so that's a nice list that we have there, but we have to sit and break down the list for each one of those documents.
We're not looking at
when.
We're not looking at submittals or RFIs we're primarily looking at drawings. Or at least that was my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong. So that's the.
I don't think ISO's gone really beyond drawings yet. I don't think ISO 19650 has really gotten into like RFI level, but it's an interesting thought exercise of like, is there a structure there that we could apply to RFIs? That's a great question for us to ask, but I think it's premature.
Okay. No, that's it. That's an interesting point. I mean, because to me, those are all documents. They're all a very important part of the process, and they need to be tackled. But if we're limiting the conversation to drawings only, that makes a huge difference about what we're looking at on that list.
It's design documents technically, which you want to throw specifications in there, but that it's just design documents. And the unfortunate part, but when we were in Denver, we had some people from, it was great to have Newforma and Bluebeam and Ignite, obviously on the call. So we have a couple of different vendors that wear traditionally different hats. If you want to look at Procore and Newforma, hopefully we can get some of that information of like, we don't have to have a best practice from a client perspective. From a live job, we can do a better swing and a miss beforehand with the Newforma, or whoever those other vendors might be, like Autodesk or whoever wants to help say, hey, these are the ones that we're thinking make the most sense.
Yeah, I think that, and that to me is a huge piece of information that right there. To me, when I was looking at that list, I was thinking all project documents, but when we're talking about drawings, now when I think back at that list, there's a bunch of stuff that I have no idea why it's on there, and a bunch of things right away that I'm like, why isn't that on that list? From my perspective. But I'm only one little section of that over there, right? So I think that's maybe where the conversation needs to start, is if we're just talking about drawings, maybe walking through that list of data and which point in the process those data points define, right? Is that the architect handing off to the general contractor, or the architect handing off to the owner for review, or the authority having jurisdiction, or whoever it is? What point is that? And then the other people that are involved in that process, what do their points look like as well? Because I think you're going to see there's some different, like my first question is, I don't remember seeing scale on that list. I would definitely, if I'm getting data, want to know what scale the architect's drawings in, because I can't tell you how many times I've gotten drawings from design and the architect's drawing is in a different scale than the structural engineer's drawing.
I think you just really kind of highlighted the difficulty on all this, because we joke all the time, because I think somebody said it earlier, like it's hard to create standards and nobody wants to accept a standard unless you've standardized on them. So I mean, this is just going to be a long, almost like we just need to take representatives of each major group over whatever sections this touches, lock them in a conference room and just let them duke it out, and then come out with an industry standard.
Well, and there may be a way to think about this from a level of like, it's classifications and subclassifications of information. And so like, how do we take that and scaffold it down? So this is a design document, that is a drawing that was done by a trade that captures this portion of the building scope, or whatever those fields are. Because then it can truly be as flexible of, design documents have a series of subclassifications that relate to them, and RFI may have a series of subclassifications that relate to them. And there can be this tree of document classifications that help us define what everything is. I think we need to think about like, how are we going to use this? How is it going to be leveraged? What are the data fields that we need on a project, on a team, on a document type basis? And really like dig into what those are. And I know like the Building Institute has created BIM standards. There's this, there's inspiration all over. It's just something, trying to figure out how we can get everybody to the meat as quickly as possible by knowing what classifications to be looking for, and having that consistent across the technologies.
So I like the idea of putting them in a room, locking them in a room and duking it out, Travis. But I think the question lies in, Matt, from your perspective in working with the tool to build it for ISO 19650, should we be duking it out, or should we be kind of taking somebody else's advice here?
I think, and again, this is just a personal opinion, I think enough countries have adopted it where they do see the value. And again, this would be a mandated governmental compliance that all companies need to at least have this set of fields and data, and then they can have whatever else data they want. And I think it would be good to, have that full list, right? Not just what needs to be added to every file name, but also what else should be there. Sure, I think some companies can have their own custom fields that make sense for them, but when you're sharing across all of the different contractors, across all the different projects, there should be at least a small set of data that needs to be shared. And then we can expose that via APIs, and they're all called the same thing, just like we said, what's classification? Maybe you call that something different, but in the APIs, they should be called the same, so it's easy to pass that information. But yeah, it would be, I can't say whether you should duke it out or not, but I do think we should take the advice of what the other countries have done and they've seen the benefits of, and then again, add our own flavor on what we need.
Right. There's a difference there in minimum standards and then what you can actually do. You can decide to do more than the minimum at any time, but at some point we've got to realize the benefits, we've got to adopt a minimum. And that's what ISO 19650 has done. So Carol, you're kind of shaking your head there. Is that kind of where the group got, just to help the others that weren't in that group? Is that where you guys got, is that, hey, this exists, we should do this?
Well, it was really kind of the seed of this conversation, really, is where we left it off. So there had to be, and the duking it out, I guess I just, painted it differently and called it rules of engagement. So that way, you know what I mean? So that, yes, there has to be some sort of agreement. I guess my question is, in here and listening to all of this, is then, people have to know why they're actually adopting a new standard, period. I mean, it's one thing to teach how and all of this stuff, but why is the biggest question. And so I would be curious to have a better understanding of, what's the direct line between adoption of ISO 19650 and cost savings on any given project. Does
And
that
would be interesting. Yeah, Matt,
does that exist?
Yeah, Matt, do you or Travis have any experience? And obviously you guys built this tool out to support that, where that came from, that they're actually realizing the savings.
Yeah, I think the UK was the first, and they realized, someone came up with that 20% savings. I don't know what projects they evaluated that on, and how many contractors were involved to evaluate that ROI. We do have one of the main consultancies in the UK, Evolve, who has been consulting with all the vendors and contractors in UK on this. They would have a better understanding of how they're calculating that. I could probably share that in the future.
I think that would be great, because sometimes we have to beat ourselves over the head with the information to do the right thing. That's just our way, but it would be interesting to see that, and maybe that would flush out some reasons for the rest of the team to kind of start to think about it. Daniel, turn on your camera. Did you just fall in the wrong room, or did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was actually, obviously you'll detect the accent. I'm from the UK. Yeah, and I kind of agree a lot with what Kelly's been saying, is that what it feels like to me, and I'm brand new to this conversation, and I'm actually working for a company called Technobuilt, who's a tech company who's got a whole bunch of subject matter experts from the industry applying technology to how do we do jobs better. And one of the things that seems to be coming across here is that everything I've really heard is about document management. It's about how do you do a naming convention that helps people find information. And that is really good, because if you don't have that, then you really struggle to find information. But that's, as what Kelly said, that's not data management. Data management is completely different. It's something else. And we haven't got there with the data management. I think we're still talking about a convention for document management, which really does help people find documents. Once they've found the document, they want the information, but they want it digitally. The question is, how do you store that information that matches a convention, and how do you store it in a manner that is easy to find for each of the component parts, which is who created the information, who's actually approved the information, who's actually consuming the information, and does that logic of data and information sequence make sense? That for me is about data management. What I feel we're talking about right now with the standard is a document control type standard, not a data management standard. Anyway, that was my point.
And it's a great point, Daniel, because we need to, one of the conversations that we never have around this, especially in the construction world, is that all of these tools and all of these things that we do bring in data, and we're not doing anything to build up data architecture and data governance so that we can manage the data and properly control the data as it comes in so that it's usable later in the future.
Absolutely right. And I was at a meeting in Austin last week where we talked about, someone introduced the idea about this data standard, and I thought, well, I've never really heard about the data standard. And right now what we're doing is basically how can we connect information based on an area basis, whether it be discipline, classification of drawing, whatever, have a numbering convention that's got some level of intelligence such that you can connect that area intelligence and put it in a sequence, put it in a plan, such that each of the functions get to understand this is the disciplines of engineering that created it. These are the supply chain guys that have got the material to match the engineering data. And this is the sequence of the data that's going to be used by the constructor. And we can actually have data exchange that is in a sequence that matches how we want to build it eventually turn it over. The data is sitting behind the documentation. And at the moment, again, I'm repeating myself, this feels like a standard. And I think the numbers are probably significant, that if you do have a numbering standard or a convention that makes it easier to find information, you're going to have savings, definitely. But that's not data management, that's just document management, and it still makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we keep talking about all these tools that we keep adding, and how to pass information through the process and between stakeholders and things like that. And honestly, it's not going to do a damn bit of good if we don't take care of the data management in-house first, so that we can pass internal data back and forth between our own departments before we try and receive it from external people.
And you know what? It's been the age-old thing, well, age-old, probably in the last 10, 15 years, but the issue that everyone's been searching for, and I used to work for a big firm, you guys may have heard of them, it was AMEC, then AMEC Foster Wheeler, then it became Wood. And all of these other big companies, they've all been trying their hardest to find, how can we get system integration? And it's failed everyone. No one's managed to do it yet. And I think what Kelli said earlier is certainly where we're going, is that you need a platform that's agnostic to be able to take any information, bring it into that platform, organize it, and make sure it's distributed to the right people on the project. That's really, I think, what we want to do. We don't want to be creating data lakes. We want to be creating data that is a meaningful package size for each user, all the way through to the final asset being completed, whether it be a hospital or an oil and gas facility or a nuclear facility.
I mean, even though you don't know for sure what people are, how honest they are, the industry data could be helpful for you in understanding why people are pulled or why people are pushed. And then you can see whether those factors are at play in your organization. But Yui, do you have?
I was going to say, Betsy, you came in right under the wire. I think we're about to pull the groups back together. That was timed perfectly. But Yuhi, with a few moments left, I do want to give you some ability to respond.
Yeah, no, I mean, Betsy said it perfectly. I think, being able to look at that like engagement, quote unquote, data against the demographic group is really key, because this does happen a lot we know a lot of our general contractors and specialty trades, like we are heavily white, heavily male organizations in most cases. And so it makes sense, honestly, that your engagement score is really high, because the majority is answering those questions and the majority is dictating what the overall score ends up being. And so it is really, really important to start to really apply the demographic filter to the experiential data to really better understand, like, is this actually every single person, or is this the majority, which seems like the company?
Great questions. Darren, you hit the nail on the head with that one, because I think that was the piece we hadn't really uncovered here, was if we are measuring, maybe we're going, it's fine. In fact, the last roundtable we had, we asked how many were having challenging conversations around diversity inclusion, and the answer was 2% of those attending.
Wow.
So we were like, okay, so even in our group here, we're not having a appropriate representation of where we probably need to lean in the most. So, which is why we think this is so important for us at this stage, is to say, let's really start to do some research around this in order to give the business leaders greater insights into really where they should be focusing their efforts, getting a baseline of really where are we, and then being able to give them the tools to assess their own businesses and choose the culture that they want in order to become that employer of choice. So thank you so much to Yuhi and Betsy for joining. And I really appreciate Darren and Bianca for being in the gallery and asking their questions today. The group is going to be joining us back in here shortly.
Oh, we're back. We've been
Oh,
back.
you're back.
Thank you. We've been listening this whole time, Sasha.
That should be a very interesting re-entry for everyone.
I know. They're like, wait, were we talking about inclusion, diversity? Because all I heard was data and stats and analytics and engagement and everything that, we'd be talking about in our room.
Only the CPC is having a data-driven conversation around D&I. I love it.
I love it.